Centuries ago, the Ottoman Empire stood as one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. Its armies stretched across 3 continents. Its rulers commanded vast wealth, and its cities dazzled the world with mosques, palaces, and bustling markets. To many, it was an empire of grandeur and brilliance. But beneath the glittering surface, behind the domes and mosaics, lay a reality far darker, an organized system of exploitation that turned human lives into instruments of power. This was not isolated cruelty. It was policy. It was strategy. And it was recorded in detail by the empire's own administrators, diplomats, and witnesses. What unfolded over centuries was a machine of control, one that weaponized the most intimate aspects of human existence. One of the most devastating practices was the devsh, also known as the child levy or blood tax. Ottoman officials regularly swept through Christian villages not for grain or gold, but for children. Records were meticulously kept. Every household, every son, every suitable age. Boys as young as 7 were seized, some even younger. Once taken, they were stripped of their names, their languages, and their faith. Within months, many no longer remembered who they had been. Some were trained as soldiers in the elite Janissary Corps, sworn to celibacy, devoted entirely to the Sultan, their lives consumed by duty. Others, judged too beautiful for the battlefield, were sent into the palace, where their futures grew even darker. Among the most disturbing realities of the empire was what happened to the youngest and most attractive boys. Their futures were decided not by fate or family, but by a cold system that measured them as tools for power. Some were condemned to become eunuchs. The process was nothing short of merciless. Operations carried out in distant provinces claimed most of the children's lives. The empire accepted this staggering loss rate as if it were simple arithmetic, sacrificing 9 boys so that one might survive to serve. Those who lived bore scars deeper than the body. They were forced into categories that defined the rest of their existence. African boys who endured complete removal became the empire's black eunuchs. Many of them rose to positions of trust within the palace, overseeing the sultan's wives and concubines. European boys who typically faced partial removal became the white eunuchs destined for administrative roles in the machinery of governance. Both groups were cut off from love, marriage, and family, stripped not just of flesh, but of every possibility of an ordinary life. Others were forced into another role altogether. The coach dancers draped in silks, faces painted, bodies trained to mimic the gestures of women. They performed at feasts and festivals for the amusement of men whose excitement often turned violent. These performances meant to entertain frequently descended. Their very existence blurred the line between genders, trapping them in an identity that society refused to recognize as fully human. And then there was the empire's darkest secret, the Tafshinolan, known chillingly as the Bunny Boys. Unlike the Janissaries, or even the eunuchs, these children were not part of any official structure. They existed in complete secrecy, hidden away in the private quarters of high officials. They had no rank, no status, no future. Their names disappeared from records, their lives erased as though they had never existed. For their families, there was only silence. Once taken, there were no messages, no rumors, not even whispers of survival. Parents waited in vain, their grief stretching into decades, never knowing that their sons were trapped in shadows, their existence deliberately concealed. The empire had created a system where innocence itself became a resource, and where silence was the final seal on a stolen life. If the empire's control over boys was devastating, its control over women was vast on a scale that dwarfed everything else. In the heart of Constantinople, the slave markets bustled day and night, overflowing with captives brought in from Africa, the Caucasus, and Europe. Here, human lives were reduced to price tags, measured and ranked with cold precision. A young girl could be inspected like livestock, her value determined by factors as cruel as they were arbitrary: her age, her virginity, the color of her skin, and the region she came from. Europeans, especially Greeks and Slavs, commanded the highest sums. Africans, though taken in massive numbers, were priced lower and less destined for specific palace roles. And then there were the odalisques, women carefully trained for the sultan's harem, who could sell for sums equal to a nobleman's fortune. But behind the glittering image of the harem lies a truth that shatters every romanticized myth. Far from being a paradise of luxury, it was a prison wrapped in silk. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of women lived under the same roof, each one trapped in a brutal game of survival. Their daily lives revolved around desperate attempts to capture attention, for attention meant protection, and protection meant life. Competition was fierce, and it was deliberately encouraged. Rivalries were fueled to keep the women divided, ensuring that no alliances could threaten the system. To stand out, many were forced into humiliating displays, their worth reduced to how well they could entertain or please. For those who failed, punishment was swift and merciless. Some were starved, beaten, or locked away in isolation. Others, when their youth faded, were cast aside, sold into brothel, abandoned in the streets, or quietly executed to make room for younger replacements. The fate of children born inside this system was often even more tragic. Official records show that many infants, particularly those of mixed parentage, were killed shortly after birth. Their existence deemed inconvenient to the empire's carefully guarded hierarchy. The children who survived legally belonged to the mother's owner, treated as property from the moment they drew breath. They could be sold, traded, or used however their master pleased. The harem was not a sanctuary. It was a gilded cage engineered to maintain control through fear, division, and dependency. For women inside, survival hinged not only on beauty, but on cunning, adaptability, and sheer luck. Every smile could be a mask, every whispered word a betrayal, and every day another reminder that their lives were not their own. Justice in the empire was not carried out quietly in dim chambers. It was paraded in the open, turned into theater for the masses. Public punishments became grand spectacles, staged in marketplaces and city squares, where violence itself became a form of entertainment. Those accused of crimes, especially those linked to morality or sexuality, were not simply executed. First, they were humiliated. Their punishment was carefully crafted to degrade them, to strip away every trace of dignity before life itself was taken. The crowd was not there to mourn. They came to cheer, jeer, and even gamble on the spectacle, placing bets on how long the condemned might endure. The square became less a place of justice and more a stage for cruelty. Archaeological evidence supports what the written accounts describe. These punishments were deliberately designed to do more than kill. Remains uncovered from execution sites show signs of calculated mutilation, proof that the condemned were made to suffer in ways that echoed far beyond the grave. Their broken bodies became messages, etched reminders of the empire's absolute control. For the authorities, cruelty was not an accident. It was the purpose. Every cut, every humiliation, every scream from the condemned was a lesson to those watching. This is what happens to those who defy the empire. It was fear turned into ritual. And for the spectators, the line between justice and entertainment blurred. Families brought children to watch. Vendors sold food as if it were a festival. The suffering of the few became a communal performance for the many. In this way, the empire wove violence into the fabric of daily life, normalizing it, celebrating it, and using it as one of its most powerful tools of control. What made these practices endure for centuries was how deeply they were normalized. Children grew up seeing captives sold in markets, women paraded in her, punishment staged like theater. Education reinforced it, teaching that enslavement of outsiders was divinely sanctioned. Resistance was framed as rebellion against God. Economics played a central role. Human trafficking funded palaces, armies, and administration. Conquests were measured not just in territory, but in how many captives they could bring back. Trade routes were designed for slaves as much as for silk or spice. Even treaties between nations included terms about the exchange of human beings. The empire's ledgers leave no doubt. Pages list captives by age, origin, and price. Inventories of harems count women like furniture. Letters between officials discuss rulers' desires as though arranging shipments of goods. This was not secret. It was systemic. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed in the early 20th century, the practices didn't vanish overnight. Their memory lived on in cultural scars, in silence passed down through families, in the unhealed wounds of survivors. The greatest tragedy was not just the lives taken or broken in the moment. It was the destruction of trust, intimacy, and humanity across generations. Boys turned into soldiers who knew no family bonds. Women stripped of their identities. Parents forced into impossible choices. Entire societies reshaped by fear. This history is not about condemning a single culture or faith. It is about recognizing what happens when power turns people into property, when cruelty becomes policy, and when exploitation is normalized so deeply that it feels like order. The Ottoman system reminds us of a truth we cannot ignore. Civilization is fragile. Human dignity, once abandoned, can be erased with terrifying speed. The stories of those who suffered deserve to be remembered not as curiosities of a distant past, but as warnings for